The presentation room was packed, the projector flickering across the wall, and I could feel every eye in the room on him, on Imran Voss as he stood confidently at the front. "This project, absolutely groundbreaking," he said, smiling as if the genius behind it was his alone. My stomach lurched. Every carefully calculated slide, every detail painstakingly researched for weeks stolen. And here he was, taking all the credit, while I was expected to sit quietly, smile, and applaud. What the hell just happened? I gripped the edge of the conference table, fingernails biting into the polished wood, and tried to steady my racing heart. Colleagues glanced between us, some unsure, some clearly entertained by the drama unfolding. Imran basked in the attention, laughing lightly, as though my silence was confirmation that he had won. Humiliation burned hot through my veins, but beneath it, a quiet, calculated fury began to grow like fire catching dry wood. He thinks this is clever. He's about to learn just how wrong he is. I'm Celine Maley, and while everyone in that room assumed this was my defeat, it was actually the beginning of a plan only I could execute with precision. While Imran was enjoying temporary applause and congratulations, I was already envisioning the perfect setup, where he would be the one standing in front of everyone, scrambling, exposed, and powerless. I forced a calm, polite smile settling deeper into my chair as he delivered lines I had written, gestures I had practiced in front of my bathroom mirror. "Well done, Imran," I said, my voice smooth and controlled. But inside, every fiber of me was alive with strategy and determination. Every stolen word, every exaggerated nod, every subtle applause from the crowd was fuel for what was coming next. By the time he clicked to the final slide with a flourish, I wasn't defeated. I was a strategist preparing for war. That day, I didn't interrupt, I didn't retaliate, and I didn't lose my composure even slightly. I was already planting seeds for revenge. The memory of those nights still burned fresh in my mind like yesterday. I recalled endless hours bent over my laptop, the screen's blue glow the only light in my apartment at 3 a.m. Nights of work, late research sessions, meticulous planning that had consumed every spare moment I had for 6 weeks straight. Coffee cups stacked like towers on my desk, my eyes burning from exhaustion and strain. I'd mapped every statistic, analyzed every competitor, created projections that would impress the toughest executives in our industry. This project wasn't just work. It represented my credibility, my career trajectory, my pride as a professional. I'd poured my heart and soul into every single detail, believing that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. I'd trusted that hard work mattered in this company. I'd been naive enough to believe that talent spoke for itself. Now, watching Imran steal my thunder, I realized how foolish I'd been to trust anyone in this cutthroat environment. The stakes were higher than I'd understood. Everything I'd worked for was at risk. Walking alone through the parking garage after the presentation, I reflected on the betrayal with cold clarity. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that matched my mood perfectly. My heels clicked against concrete in steady rhythm. They think I'm powerless, I thought, my jaw clenched tight. They think I'll just accept this humiliation and move on quietly like a good little employee. They have no idea what I'm capable of when pushed too far. My mind raced through possibilities, discarding emotional reactions in favor of calculated strategy. Screaming wouldn't help. Complaining to HR would make me look petty and vindictive. Public confrontation would damage my professional reputation more than his. No, this required something far more subtle and devastating. I needed Imran to destroy himself while I watched from a safe distance. The best revenge wouldn't be loud or obvious. It would be quiet, methodical, and absolutely undeniable. I'd learned from watching others fail. Emotion makes you sloppy, but patience makes you deadly. I just needed to identify his weakness and exploit it perfectly. I noticed something crucial during that presentation that everyone else had missed completely. Imran's arrogance was matched only by his lack of preparation for potential scrutiny or tough questions. He'd memorized my slides well enough to present them smoothly, but he didn't actually understand the underlying research or methodology that supported each conclusion. When one executive had asked a mildly challenging question about data sources, I'd seen Imran hesitate for just a fraction of a second before deflecting with charm and confidence. Most people hadn't noticed that tiny moment of panic in his eyes, but I had. I'd seen it clearly because I knew exactly where his knowledge ended and my expertise began. This is his vulnerability, I realized with growing excitement. He can perform, but he can't defend the work under real pressure. He doesn't know the details, the calculations, the reasoning behind each decision I'd made. He'd stolen the presentation without stealing the actual understanding. That gap between performance and knowledge would be his downfall. I just needed to create the perfect situation to expose it publicly and devastatingly. The next day, I sought out Leora, my mentor who'd been with the company for 15 years. She had a corner office and a reputation for cutting through corporate politics with brutal honesty. I found her reviewing reports, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "I need advice," I said quietly, closing her door behind me. Leora looked up, immediately reading something in my expression. "What happened?" I told her everything, Imran's theft, the presentation, my humiliation, and my suspicions about his shallow understanding of the project. Leora listened without interrupting, her face growing serious. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with a long exhale. "Celine, you're right to be angry, but be smart about this." Her validation felt like oxygen after drowning. Someone believed me, understood me, saw the injustice clearly. "He's careless," Leora continued thoughtfully. "Arrogant people always are. They assume success will continue effortlessly." She paused, studying me carefully. "But be warned, fighting back subtly is dangerous. If you're going to do this, you need to be absolutely certain you can execute it flawlessly without getting caught in the crossfire yourself." Over the following days, I carefully gathered intelligence like a detective building a case. I studied client reactions during meetings, noting which executives asked detailed questions and which accepted surface-level answers. I observed executive expectations, understanding what impressed them versus what made them skeptical. Most importantly, I watched Imran closely, documenting his habitual shortcuts and lazy patterns. He never read background materials thoroughly before meetings. He relied heavily on charm and confident body language to compensate for actual knowledge gaps. He delegated research to others without verifying their work personally. These weren't just observations, they were weaknesses I could exploit strategically. I started keeping detailed notes in a private journal at home, tracking every instance where Imran fumbled a question or deflected rather than answering directly. Patterns emerged clearly. He was excellent at initial presentations, but terrible at follow-up discussions requiring depth. The critical error I was looking for revealed itself. He couldn't handle unexpected technical questions without preparation time. That realization made my heart race with anticipation. I knew exactly how to use that weakness against him, devastatingly. Meanwhile, Imran continued basking in his stolen glory without any awareness of gathering storm clouds. He boasted to colleagues about his successful project during lunch breaks, accepting congratulations with false modesty that made my skin crawl. "It was challenging, but I pulled it together," he'd say with a self-satisfied smile. I watched from nearby tables, eating my salad slowly while listening to every word. He embellished details, making the project sound even more impressive than it actually was. He told stories about late nights working that he'd never actually experienced. His confidence grew with each retelling, inflating his ego dangerously. The more he talked, the more convinced he became of his own brilliance. This was perfect for my plans. His overconfidence was blinding him to reality, making him careless and vulnerable. He stopped preparing thoroughly for meetings because he believed his natural talent was sufficient. He stopped double-checking facts because he trusted his memory and charm. Every boast, every exaggeration, every moment of unearned pride was another nail in his professional coffin. I just needed to be patient and wait for the perfect moment to spring my trap. I began testing his knowledge subtly with indirect questions during team meetings. "Imran, remember that methodology you presented last week? I'm curious about the statistical model you chose. What made you select that specific approach over alternatives?" I'd ask innocently, as if genuinely interested in learning from him. He'd pause, his smile flickering slightly before launching into vague, generalized answers that sounded impressive but said nothing concrete. "Well, it's really about finding the right fit for the data," he'd respond smoothly. "You have to consider multiple factors and use professional judgment." I'd nod thoughtfully, making notes as if satisfied, but internally cataloging every evasion and non-answer. Other times, I'd reference specific data points from my research. Those consumer behavior statistics were fascinating. Where did you source those originally? Imran would grow slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Multiple sources, compiled over time, he'd say vaguely. The gaps and inconsistencies were becoming obvious to me, though most colleagues still seemed fooled by his confident delivery. Tension built with each interaction as I mapped exactly what he knew versus what he'd merely memorized. Now came the crucial phase, preparing the trap with meticulous attention to detail. I needed to create a scenario where Imran would be forced to present unprepared under pressure, without time to memorize my work or prepare deflections. This required careful orchestration of multiple moving pieces simultaneously. First, I needed executive buy-in for a follow-up presentation without making it obvious I was setting anything up. I started mentioning casually to senior leaders that clients had expressed interest in deeper technical details. They loved the overview, but they're asking more specific questions about implementation, I'd say to our department head during casual hallway conversations. Second, I needed to ensure Imran would be positioned as the primary presenter without my direct involvement being obvious. I volunteered to support him, playing the role of helpful colleague while actually controlling the narrative. Third, and most critically, I needed the presentation to include technical elements that required real understanding, not just memorized talking points. Everything depended on timing and execution being absolutely perfect. One mistake, one moment of obvious manipulation, and my plan would collapse spectacularly, probably taking my career down with it. I began planting doubt with executives through carefully controlled hints and strategic conversations. During a coffee break with our VP of Operations, I mentioned casually, "The client presentation went well, though I noticed a few technical details that might need clarification if they dig deeper." I didn't accuse Imran directly. That would be too obvious and petty. Instead, I positioned myself as conscientious and detail-oriented, someone who cared about accuracy above personal credit. "What kind of details?" the VP asked, suddenly attentive. "Just some of the statistical methodology explanations," I said thoughtfully. "The conclusions are solid, but if they ask about specific calculation methods, we'll want to be prepared with thorough answers." I smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure it's fine, just want to make sure we're covered for any technical questions." The VP nodded slowly, and I could see the seed taking root in his mind. Suspense built over the following days as similar conversations happened with other executives. I never pushed too hard, never seemed eager to undermine Imran. I just raised gentle, professional concerns that made them start questioning whether the presentation had been as flawless as they'd initially believed. The shift began subtly, like ice cracking beneath the surface. Executives started asking Imran more probing questions during routine meetings. "Can you walk me through the data validation process you used?" our CFO asked during a budget review. Imran fumbled slightly, his usual smooth confidence wavering for just a moment. "We use standard validation protocols," he answered vaguely. "The methodology is sound." But the CFO pressed further. "Which specific protocols?" "I need to understand the rigor for my own reporting." Imran's discomfort became more visible, a slight sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. He deflected with humor and charm, but the executives were less easily satisfied than before. I watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction, maintaining my calm, professional demeanor while internally celebrating each small victory. This was emotional payoff in miniature, tiny tastes of control returning to me after weeks of powerlessness. The balance of perception was shifting gradually. Executives who'd been dazzled by Imran's initial presentation were now wondering if there was substance behind the style. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and I was wielding it with surgical precision. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, I gained allies among colleagues who'd always been professional but distant. They started noticing my competence and reliability when contrasted against Imran's increasingly defensive behavior. During team meetings, I'd offer clear, detailed answers to technical questions while Imran deflected or spoke in generalities. I helped junior team members with their projects, sharing knowledge generously without seeking credit. I stayed late to ensure deliverables were perfect, building a reputation for thoroughness that stood in stark contrast to Imran's flashier but shallower approach. People began coming to me with questions instead of him, a shift that didn't happen overnight but accumulated gradually through consistent demonstration of expertise. "Celine, can you explain this analysis?" became a common refrain. I always helped willingly, never mentioning that much of the foundational work was originally mine. My momentum built naturally, organically, without obvious self-promotion. This was crucial. I needed to be seen as genuinely competent, not as someone trying to tear down a rival. The distinction mattered enormously for how people perceived the developing situation between Imran and me. Watching Imran's struggle with minor inconsistencies gave me internal satisfaction that I carefully hid behind professional composure. During a client call, he misquoted a statistic I'd researched, and I saw our project manager's eyebrows raise slightly in confusion. I said nothing during the call, but afterward, I gently corrected the information in a follow-up email to the client. "Just wanted to clarify one data point from today's discussion," I wrote professionally, providing the accurate figure with source documentation. Imran's face when he saw that email was priceless, a mixture of embarrassment and anger that he couldn't express publicly without looking petty. Another time, he referenced a competitor analysis incorrectly, and I casually mentioned the accurate details during the next team meeting, framing it as helpful clarification rather than correction. Each small moment chipped away at his credibility while building mine. I maintained calm, confident silence through it all, never gloating, never appearing vindictive, just competent, reliable, and detail-oriented. The professional persona I cultivated was essential to my plan's success. I needed to be above reproach when the final confrontation came. The opportunity I'd been waiting for finally arrived through channels I'd carefully cultivated. Our department head called a meeting to discuss an upcoming major client presentation, a follow-up to Imran's stolen triumph, but with much higher stakes and expectations. "This client is considering a significant contract expansion," she explained to the assembled team. "They want a deeper dive into implementation specifics, timeline projections, and resource allocation strategies." My heart raced with anticipation, but I kept my expression neutral and attentive. This was it, the perfect scenario I'd been engineering for weeks. The presentation would require genuine technical knowledge, not just memorized slides and charm. "Imran," the department head continued, "since you led the initial presentation so successfully, I want you to lead this follow-up as well." Imran smiled confidently, completely unaware he was being led to professional slaughter. "Absolutely," he agreed immediately. "I'd be honored." Then, as I'd planned, I arranged my own involvement. "I'd be happy to provide support," I offered helpfully, "just to ensure we have all technical details covered." The department head nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Teamwork is crucial for this opportunity." Presentation day arrived with clear skis and my carefully constructed trap ready to spring. The conference room was filled with executives from both our company and the client's leadership team. The stakes were enormous, a potential multi-million-dollar contract expansion that could define careers. I observed quietly from my seat, appearing calm and supportive while my plan moved into its final phase. Imran stood at the front, looking polished and confident in his expensive suit. He'd prepared his opening remarks well, delivering them with his characteristic charm and smooth delivery. For the first few slides, everything proceeded normally. He talked about project scope and general objectives using language I'd written months ago. But then the presentation shifted into technical territory that required actual understanding. The first fumbles were small, reading slides with slightly less confidence, hesitating fractionally before clicking forward. He misread a chart, transposing two statistics in a way that made them meaningless. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably, noticing the error even if they didn't comment immediately. Cliffhanger tension filled the air as I stayed composed, ready to strike at precisely the right moment. The client executives, experienced professionals who'd heard countless presentations, started asking difficult, precise questions that required genuine expertise to answer properly. "Can you explain the algorithm you're using for predictive modeling?" one asked directly. Imran's confident smile faltered. "It's a proprietary algorithm we developed," he responded vaguely. "Very sophisticated." The client executive pressed further, unsatisfied. But what type of machine learning approach? Supervised or unsupervised? What's your training data set? Panic rose visibly in Imrin's eyes. He'd never asked me these questions when stealing my work, never bothered to understand the underlying methodology. It's a hybrid approach, he stammered, trying to sound knowledgeable. We use multiple techniques depending on data characteristics. But his answer was too vague, too obviously evasive. Another client executive jumped in with a follow-up question about statistical significance and confidence intervals. Imrin struggled to answer, his usual smooth delivery completely abandoned in favor of nervous improvisation. The room's energy shifted dramatically, from respectful attention to concerned skepticism. I could feel the exact moment when credibility began draining from Imrin like water from a broken dam. My moment was approaching rapidly. I waited until Imrin had thoroughly embarrassed himself before making my move strategically. He'd stammered through 3 more inadequate answers, his forehead now visibly sweating under the conference room lights. Then I subtly hinted at solutions with perfect timing. "If I may," I interjected gently, my voice calm and professional. I believe what Imrin is referencing relates to the regression analysis framework I developed during the initial research phase. I pulled up my laptop, displaying detailed documentation I'd prepared weeks ago. The predictive model uses supervised learning with a random forest classifier, trained on 3 years of historical transaction data with an 89% accuracy rate on validation sets. The room's attention shifted immediately from Imrin to me. I explained complex technical concepts clearly and confidently, demonstrating mastery that couldn't be faked or memorized. I referenced specific calculations, showed my detailed methodology, explained decision points with supporting rationale. The client executives nodded, finally satisfied with substantive answers. But the subtext was devastating. I was exposing gaps only I could have foreseen because I'd done the actual work. Imrin stood frozen beside the presentation screen, his face pale as he realized what was happening. His confidence crumbled like a sandcastle in rising tide. Imrin's public humiliation accelerated as the presentation continued its catastrophic trajectory. He attempted to regain control several times, but each effort only highlighted his fundamental lack of understanding. He misrepresented data, describing trends incorrectly in ways that made the client executives exchange concerned glances. He confused causation with correlation when explaining consumer behavior patterns. He contradicted his own previous statements without realizing it, creating logical inconsistencies that undermined everything he said. When a client executive asked about implementation timeline, Imrin provided an estimate that was completely unrealistic. I'd calculated it would take 3 times longer based on resource availability and complexity. Actually, I interjected again, maintaining my helpful tone, based on our resource allocation and technical complexity analysis, we're looking at approximately 18 months for full implementation. I pulled up the detailed project plan I'd created, showing realistic milestones and dependencies. Imrin looked at the screen with obvious confusion. He'd never seen this documentation before because he'd only stolen my presentation, not my complete research files. The emotional payoff was building toward its climax as audience satisfaction grew with each revelation. People were beginning to understand what had really happened with the original presentation. The reputation shift happened visibly during that disastrous meeting, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Key stakeholders who'd initially dismissed me as merely support staff began recognizing my actual expertise and central role in the project. Our CFO caught my eye and nodded with new respect and understanding. The department head's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization about who'd really done the work. Even the client executives, who had no context for our internal politics, clearly recognized that I possessed the knowledge and competence they needed for this major contract. During a brief break, our VP of operations pulled me aside quietly. "Selling, it's becoming clear that you have much deeper involvement in this project than initially presented," he said carefully, his words diplomatically acknowledging the obvious theft without making direct accusations. "Moving forward, I think we need you taking a more visible leadership role. I nodded professionally, neither gloating nor appearing vindictive despite my internal triumph. I'm happy to help however the team needs, I responded graciously. Meanwhile, tension continued rising for Imrin, who stood alone in the corner during the break, isolated and clearly panicking. People avoided him, sensing his falling star. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Former skeptics who dismissed my concerns or ignored my contributions now approached me with new recognition. A senior project manager who'd congratulated Imrin effusively after the stolen presentation now sought me out. "Celine, I have to say, your technical knowledge is really impressive," she said, her tone carrying implicit apology for previous dismissal. "I'd love to get your input on some challenges we're facing in my department." I accepted her compliment graciously, without pointing out the irony of her previous behavior. This wasn't the time for petty vindictiveness. It was the time for demonstrating the professionalism and maturity that would cement my reputation going forward. Others followed similar patterns throughout the afternoon. Colleagues who'd been lukewarm before suddenly wanted my insights, my collaboration, my expertise. I remained calm and generous with my knowledge, helping people genuinely while internally celebrating this shift in perception. My strategic patience had paid off exactly as planned. I didn't need to loudly proclaim Imrin's theft. His own incompetence had exposed it far more effectively than any accusation I could have made. The truth revealed itself through demonstration rather than declaration, which made it absolutely undeniable to everyone watching. The final blow came at the end of the presentation when the client's CEO addressed our team directly. "I appreciate the time today, but I have to be honest. We have significant concerns about project leadership and technical competency based on what we've seen." His words hung heavy in the air like a guillotine blade. Imrin's face went ashen. The client's CEO continued, his tone professional but firm. "We're not comfortable moving forward with the current arrangement." My heart pounded, but I maintained neutral composure, unsure if my plan had succeeded or backfired catastrophically. Then came the words I'd been waiting for. "However, we'd be very interested in discussing this further if Ms. Maley takes the primary leadership role with direct communication access." He looked at me directly. "Your technical knowledge and clear communication give us confidence that this project could be executed successfully under your direction." The client rejected Imrin's leadership outright, requesting a formal follow-up with me leading instead. It was complete, public vindication that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Imrin stood frozen, blindsided, and utterly humiliated before the most important audience possible. The cliffhanger tension broke into shocking resolution. I'd won, completely and decisively. The aftermath unfolded with poetic justice that felt almost too perfect to be real. Within days, Imrin's arrogance and demonstrated incompetence culminated in professional consequences that were swift and severe. He was removed from the project entirely, reassigned to a minor role with no client interaction. His reputation within the company collapsed faster than I'd imagined possible. People talked openly now about his theft, his lack of substance, his reliance on stolen work. The emotional payoff was immense. But I took no pleasure in his suffering directly. Instead, I felt satisfaction in truth being recognized and justice being served through proper channels. Our department head called me into her office 3 days after the presentation. "Celine, I owe you an apology," she said directly, her expression serious and remorseful. "I should have recognized your contributions earlier. I allowed myself to be dazzled by presentation skills instead of looking at substance." She paused, then continued with deliberate weight. "Effective immediately, you're the lead on this client account with full authority over project direction and team composition." It was everything I'd worked for, achieved not through complaints or accusations, but through demonstrating undeniable competence when it mattered most. Full satisfaction washed over me in waves. I stepped into my deserved spotlight with quiet confidence rather than triumphant gloating. The follow-up presentation with the client went flawlessly because I knew every detail intimately. I'd created them all originally. I commanded respect naturally, answering every question thoroughly, anticipating concerns before they were raised, demonstrating the expertise that had been invisible while hidden behind Imrin's theft. The client executives were impressed and relieved. signing a contract expansion that represented the largest deal our department had secured in 3 years. Colleagues congratulated me genuinely this time, recognizing authentic achievement rather than false credit. Awards and accolades followed in subsequent weeks: a promotion, a substantial bonus, recognition in company newsletters. But more valuable than any external reward was the internal transformation I felt. I'd proven to myself that integrity and competence ultimately triumph over theft and charm. I'd learned to fight strategically rather than emotionally, to be patient rather than reactive. As I reflected on my journey from humiliation to triumph, I recognized how much I'd grown through this challenge. The experience had tested me, refined me, strengthened me in ways that extended far beyond this single situation. I'd become someone who knew her worth and wouldn't accept being diminished by others' dishonesty. The empowering closure came quietly, without dramatic confrontation or final showdown. Imran and I never had a direct conversation about what happened. There was nothing left to say. He avoided me completely, taking a position in a different department within 2 months, essentially running from his humiliation. He never contacted me again, and I felt no need to seek him out. The catharsis was complete without requiring his acknowledgement or apology. What mattered was the lesson I'd internalized and would carry forward throughout my career. Never let anyone steal your work, but also never fight battles with emotion when strategy is more effective. Plan quietly, act methodically, and let people reveal their true nature through their own actions. I'd risen stronger from this experience, more confident, more strategic, more aware of my value. My internal monologue during a quiet moment in my new corner office captured everything. They tried to make me invisible, to steal my contributions and diminish my worth, but I refused to disappear. I refused to let theft define me. Instead, I let truth emerge naturally, inevitably, undeniably. I smiled to myself, looking out over the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Patience and competence will always outlast arrogance and deception. Always. My revenge had been perfect because it wasn't really revenge at all. It was simply justice revealing itself through truth.